To say thank you, as always, to Carmen Rendell, who is co-hosting this. CAMPfire Tales was a concept that she came up with in the first place, right at the start of the pandemic, towards the end, or middle of March it was, and we held these CAMPfire Tales on a weekly basis for 3 months, and now we do it on a monthly basis every first Thursday of the month. And each time I bring in a colleague or some personality, somebody in the business, a guide perhaps, who's I've worked with, and who has stories to tell. And the emphasis always is on story, because that's what people mostly want to hear. And as you know, I've written a couple of books of stories, as has Peter Allison, who's here this evening. In fact, he's the one who inspired me to write them in the first place. And so we're going to tell some stories, and so is Grant. Now, I'll introduce you to Grant in a second. But it was Grant's idea, as we discussed this, to talk about elephants. And so this evening we're going to be talking or reflecting on elephants and telling some stories around elephants. And I've asked Peter Allison to comment also towards the end of the program. And he will be joining me in a month's time, as Grant is this evening. And we'll be doing this sort of thing, but with a rather different theme. So let's talk about elephants before we get to the story. And just by way of introduction,
we're listening to
you know, when you take people on safari, as we do, as many of us on this forum do, the thing that people want to see most is lions and elephants. I mean, they obviously want to see zebras and giraffes and kurus and leopards, of course, you know, the prince of the bush, etc. But essentially, if you can show people lions, the major predator in the African bush, and elephants, it tends to fulfill most of their needs. And I think elephants hold a very special attraction for us as people who go on safari and as guides. And I think the reason probably is that elephants are most like us as humans. I think more so even than the primates, like, you know, mountain gorillas and chimpanzees, because they most closely, to my mind, resemble us in terms of our moods and emotions and the way they raise their children, their lifespans, the way they behave, their sense of humor. And so they are constantly fascinating animals. Now, if you've been on safari, you'll know very well that a lot of the time through the heat of the day, animals don't do very much at all. They tend to lie down and rest and save energy. Elephants are gratifying animals on safari because they're so active and so busy and so interesting to watch. Many of us here have seen the giant bull elephants with the huge tusks of mana pools on the Zambezi River, for example, in Zimbabwe, which are giant statuesque animals, peaceful and wonderful and calm. And they have a kind of a presence about them that is totally awe-inspiring. And on the other hand, if you've ever watched a herd of elephants go down to water to drink, especially if there's little babies running down to the water, squealing, so excited, standing on their own little tendril trunks, tripping themselves up, falling in the water, playing, etc., it's very reminiscent of the way we behave as humans, and it's very, very heartwarming. So they're wonderful to watch because they're active all through the day and also through the night. But the thing about elephants is that they're also the most problematic of the wild animals in terms of the so-called human-wildlife conflict, because they're very intelligent animals. And they're not stupid. And if they can easily feed by raiding a farmer's crops, a tribal village's crops, and destroy an entire crop of mahangu or maize or corn or pumpkins in a single night, you can imagine how hated they are. And there are many African villagers who scratch a hard living from the earth and who will tell you, even though they know you love elephants and what you do for a living is to bring people to Africa and show them these things, that they hate them and they want them dead. And it's an entirely separate thing to hunting elephants. We're talking about animals that affect people's livelihoods, break their water pumps and knock over their windmills and eat their crops, and sometimes molest people too. So there's a lot to be said about elephants, and they do present real problems to people in Africa. just before we get to the first story, in terms of numbers, in our lifetime, we've seen elephants reduce from millions in Africa, literally millions, to what the World Wildlife Foundation, WWF, estimates is probably about 400,000 elephants across Africa. Now, if you think that's a lot of elephants, you're wrong. At the moment, they're being poached at a rate of about 35,000 per annum. These numbers are very hard to verify. But if it is 35,000 per annum, that's about 55 every single day for their ivory. And we're not talking major ivory, talking small tusks now, because most of the big tuskers have been hunted or poached already. So in theory, elephants could be extinct in 20 years at that sort of rate. So this is why elephants need talking about. They're keystone species, and they're easy things to attach emotion and, importantly, money to if you're a fundraiser. So elephants are important, but they're also very gratifying. I'm going to ask Grant to talk about the Botswana die-off of elephants down the line. He's got that planned, and we'll come to that later. But I would just like to introduce him quickly. Grant Nel and I worked at Mala Mala Game Reserve 30 years ago. And he was instrumental in getting Sue and I to Botswana to help manage a small camp called Zabalianja. And he remained with that company in northern Botswana. And to this day, well, he's a Botswana citizen. He lives in Kasane in the northeastern corner, the closest corner to Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, where those countries come together. He's a stone's throw from that. He's a very active guide, although, of course, since COVID, not so active like all of us. And his company is called Last Chance Safaris. And he and I go back a very long way. And we've had lots of adventures together. So, Grant, thank you very much for joining this evening. And as always, it's really good to hear your stories and your views. But let's move straight onto the first story. And this story will resonate with all guides and anybody who's been on safari, and most particularly who is ever at Mala Mala Game Reserve in South Africa, which is where I started guiding back in 1992. And there was an elephant there that, who knows, to this day he might yet live, because elephants can live to 60 plus. And his name was the Camp Raider. Now, the Camp Raider was one of those elephants that had figured out, and he was a big bull elephant. He wasn't an elephant that you messed with. And he was one of those elephants that had figured out that he was actually faster and probably smarter than we humans. And he had lost all fear of us. And he was very hard to keep out of camp. Now, the problem with that is, there's never a fence around the camp. You don't want that on a safari. You want animals to wander through, particularly at nighttime. And they do. Lions and buffaloes and elephants and everything else. So you welcome them in camp, provided they behave themselves. The problem with the Camp Raider was that he was a big bull elephant and he wasn't afraid of us at all. And one of the reasons was that Kirkman's camp at the southern end at that time of Mala Mala Game Reserve had been an old homestead where ranchers had lived, Harry Kirkman. And they had planted all sorts of exotic plants there, like bougainvillea, which prettified the place but didn't really belong. But one of the things that had been planted was lemon trees. Now, elephants absolutely love citrus fruit. It's not a natural part of their diet, and citrus has been imported to Africa, but they're not foolish, and they know that if they can get in and get to it, there's very little we can do about it. And right next to the boma is the outdoors eating area. It's normally a reed fence around a whole set of tables, and you eat out under the stars. It's a magical experience. Huge fire burning, sparks flying into the night, wonderful South African red wine, gin and tonic. So it's an enormously gratifying experience to have. But the problem is, if there's an elephant outside the boma and he's leaning against the fence and the fence is collapsing inwards upon you, it's slightly less comfortable. And the lemon trees had been planted by the old colonial folk. And although the lemons were very poor quality, they were still absolutely fantastic for an elephant to consume. They were old and gnarly and wrinkled and sour, but that didn't stop the Camp Raider. And so he would come into camp at any time of the day or night. He would drink water from the swimming pool, and the water that he drank, of course, was chlorinated, but that didn't stop him. He appeared to prefer that. It was easy water, very easy access. He would drink any time of the day, and if you were down at the pool, you simply had to give way. And so we always had a ranger on duty, watching for the camp raider. And he would come in and raid these old lemons from the tree. And you'd think that there would be none left, but somehow there'd always be a couple on the top. And one evening, he'd come in to eat the lemons, and we were all in the boma. And the camp manager, whose name was Gavin when I was there, had eventually had enough of this guy disturbing us. The thing about it, and Pete Allison has written about this in his book too, is that elephants are remarkably invisible, especially at nighttime. And they're very dark, and on a dark moon or moonless night, you can have an elephant standing right next to you on the path, and you, provided he's standing still and his tummy's not rumbling, and you wouldn't even know he's there. So we were always concerned that something dangerous might befall our guests or staff members, because he would walk through the staff village and help himself to the cooking pots, and there was nothing you could do. And there was nothing you could do to chase him away. So on this evening, he was leaning against the fence and starting to collapse the boma in on us. So we had to quickly shift everybody to one side of the boma. There was no amount of clapping of hands and shouting and yelling that would be effective in terms of chasing that old elephant away. He knew that he was impervious, and he knew there was nothing we could do to hurt him. We'd threw mud clods at him, we'd thrown gravel at him. He'd been shot in the ass with a 410 shotgun. It had absolutely no effect on the guy. He just squealed and moved off and came straight back. We'd used a catapult, which we call a catty in South Africa, a slingshot with glass marbles, almost no effect. There was nothing we could do. And Gavin, who had fought this war along with his army of rangers, had basically given up. On this particular evening, he had prepared bags of mud clods. And when the walls started to fall in, he gathered everybody on one side of the boma, left a ranger with them, and led us outside the boma to where the elephant was. Now, the elephant was feeding on this lemon tree. And, you know, when elephants feed, they don't necessarily see what they're eating. They smell it mostly. They feel around with their trunks all over the place, on the ground, into the tree, and they're smelling, and then they get a feel of it, and then they pop it into their mouth. And that's what he was doing. Just feeling around in the tree and eventually finding an old lemon, a wizened lemon, putting it in his mouth, crunching it up, swallowing it, and he had his back to us. Now, there was always a joke at Mala Mala that the way you earned your spurs was that you plucked a single hair from the tail of an elephant and made it into a bangle for your wrist. Now, we used to sell bangles made out of elephant hair in the curio shop. And those bangles, I think, actually came from elephants in the Kruger National Park, which was right next door to Mala Mala, which had been culled. At that time, there was culling of herds of elephants in the park. They no longer do that. And I think that that's where that supply of elephant hair came from. The bangles were very popular with guests and guides alike, and we used to wear them all the time. And we used to joke with our guests that that's how we had acquired these things, by plucking the hair out of a living elephant, sneaking up behind him, and then making the bangle. And it was an old joke, and any ranger who assured us that that's where he'd got it from was absolutely lying. So that evening, the elephant was there. We threw the mud clods under Gavin's supervision. We barraged that elephant, and he completely ignored us. Gavin then procured a sack of old tennis balls. There was a tennis court at Mala Mala. And we started throwing tennis balls at him. And it was a lot more fun than it was meaningful. And all they did was plop against his big, widespread, hard ears. You know, when elephants are slightly alarmed, they put their ears out to make themselves look bigger. It's very intimidating. And that's what he was doing. He'd spun around, he looked at us, he trumpeted a little bit, he had his ears out, and the tennis balls were just bouncing off his face and his ears. So there was nothing that you could do. And then he turned around and ignored us. And it was at this occasion that I saw my opportunity. Now, I have to admit that we had been indulging in some of the aforementioned South African red wine before any of this took place. And so the ink levels were reasonably high, and therefore the bravery level matched the ink level. So I realized suddenly that my opportunity to impress my fellow guides was there, because the elephant was only about 15 meters away. And they do a funny thing, elephants. You've probably seen it. They'll sometimes take the weight of one foot and they'll cross it behind the other. And they'll take the weight off and they'll stand there on three legs and then they'll change it. And they do the same with their trunks. They hang their trunk over their tusks to rest them sometimes. And this old elephant, and this is about 11 o'clock at night now, had decided to do that. And he picked up one foot and he was balanced with the back foot on the toenail. So the sole of the foot was facing me. And in my naivety, stupidity, or name it, whatever you will, I decided it was my time. And I raced forward without warning, and I jumped onto the back, on the top of that elephant's foot. Elephants do another thing when they're slightly alarmed. He just had a barrage of tennis balls aimed at him. They also stick out their tail. They stiffen it, and it sticks out horizontally. As I approached the elephant, I suddenly realized that there wasn't a hope of actually plucking anything out of his tail. But I did have the opportunity to jump up, and I grabbed his tail, and I hauled it down, and I screamed his name, and I told him to footsack, which is a fantastic South African expression, which means that you should leave immediately and with haste. And the elephant got such a fright that it kicked up and it started to run, and it threw me, and I did a sort of a somersault and landed on my back, and the elephant took off. He had never been treated with such disrespect in his life. And he took off squealing, and he ran down into the slatin, the bush, and there were a whole lot of dongas below Kirkman's camp, and he blundered through those, and he kept on running down to the Sand River, which was below us. And you could hear him crashing through the bushes all the way. And I was a bit sort of startled at having done that, and Gavin, the manager, was even more startled. And of course, I was completely unharmed. But I'd done the thing that everybody had been daring me to do for months. And so I'd finally earned my spurs. But the thing about the camp raider was, of course, was that although he was slightly shocked by this unseemly behavior, and I wouldn't recommend it, and it's certainly not part of my guide training courses, but there you go, it is what happened. It's a story that gained some traction over the years at Mala Mala. The camp raider was only gone for a day. We know where he went to, because the next morning on game drive, as we drove up through the central part of the game reserve, there was a great big steaming pile of green dung with butterflies just starting to settle on it to suck the moisture from it. And in the middle of that dung, there were heaps of lemons, sort of leached and bleached and half bitten in half. So we know we had got to. But of course, that evening, the camp raider was back. So that's the story of the camp raider. And it begs the question about how do you handle animals in camp, and how do you maintain control of your own territory when you're running a safari camp. But I want to move now to Grant. Grant, you remember the camp raider well, I'm sure.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I mean, we all had our incidences with camp raider. We've all got our own stories. He was a marvelous animal. So,
yeah. He was actually quite a harmless old guy, but he was big and potentially scary.
Yeah, and he knew who he could scare and who he couldn't scare. You know, and if it was a woman, he would give them a mock charge, and they'd all run away squealing. And I think he got a kick out of that. So,
yeah.
But the rangers and the guys, he tends to just stand there with his ears open and say, "Well, do your best.
What are you going to do about it?" Yeah.
Yeah.
So the school of thought about managing animals in camps is that we only occupy a very small footprint in the game reserve, and that we need to be dominant there. And animals can come and go at nighttime, but by day, that's our spot, because it's safer for guests and for staff. But unfortunately, and we try to manage that, but unfortunately, the camp raider hadn't read that textbook, and so he just ignored it.
He had his own agenda. Absolutely.
Yeah, his own rules. But let's move across to Grant. If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself briefly. I know you A lot of people here know you, Grant. And then Grant's got an elephant story for us. So over to you.
All right. Thanks, Lloyd. And thanks, everybody, for tuning in tonight. I know and I thank again to Lloyd for choosing Thursdays, because what else is there to do on a Thursday than come to a Zoom campfire tale? Yeah, thanks a lot. I have a little company called Last Chance Safaris. We do, much like Lloyd, we do these guided tours around Africa. Wherever you would like to go, we can take you there. I also do quite a lot of work for Smithsonian out of Washington. As they call me an expert, they don't call me a guide. I don't know where they get that word from. But anyway, that's where I get most of my bread and butter occasionally. Seems like there's a very big shortage of bread and butter this year. Don't seem to be doing anything except doing Zoom meetings. And I've also started writing a few stories, a few memoirs, and that's, Lloyd was saying he was inspired by Peter. Well, Lloyd set me on my course of trying to put a few stories down. So those can be read on the Last Chance Safaris website if anybody's interested. Now, when Lloyd phoned me and said, would you like to tell a few stories at Campfire? I said, yeah, why not? And he said he was going to talk about Camp Raider. So I said, well, let's make the whole theme about elephants. And elephants have been in the news a lot lately. So we'll get to that at the end, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm sure questions will pop up about Botswana's elephants and elephants in general. So yeah, it's fitting that he decided that we'd be talking about that. It's also a little bit ironic that Lloyd and I actually first really got to know each other courtesy of elephants. And that was way back when both of us had different color hair. I had a lot more of it. But I was still what in Mala Mala, a newish ranger is called a snot, which is a terrible name, but that's what we were called. Not greenhorns or boots or whatever you want. We were called snots. And I was sort of a little crusty snot, and this new snot arrived. His name was Lloyd Camp, I thought, which was quite funny because there was a place in Botswana that was called Lloyd's Camp that everybody knew about. And Lloyd came out on a game drive with me. And I don't know if you remember that, Lloyd. And then we went tracking elephants. And we just popped out the car, and you said to me, can we do this? I said, yeah, we're going to go and look for elephants. And we followed those elephant tracks all the way into the Kruger Park at Breeding Herd. But anyway, and we got a chance to talk to each other and that was our sort of real introduction to one another. And we've become fast friends ever since. So one of the questions that I often get asked when people arrive in Africa is they say, are elephants dangerous? And my answer is an unequivocal yes. And I'll tell you why. Because I nearly had a life-crippling injury from elephants. I had come through to Kasane. I was working out at Cylinder with Lloyd, and I'd come through to Kasane to pick up my in-laws who were coming to join us out in the bush for a couple of weeks. And we were driving back to Cylinder, and as we came around a corner, there was a breeding herd of elephants there. And those of you who have met my mother-in-law will know that elephants are not her favorite animal. They might be mine, but they're not hers. And this matriarch turned towards the vehicle, lifted her head up, raised her ears out, looked very intimidating. My mother-in-law, who was sitting next to me in the passenger seat, leaned over, put her hand on my thigh, and kept saying, Grant, Grant, Grant. And with each Grant, her talons dug deeper and deeper into my thigh until blood flow was lost. And if you look carefully to this day, you will see scars on my thigh. So yes, elephants can be dangerous. And that is about the worst injury I've had from an elephant. But anyway, anybody who's been with me on safari, and there are a few of you here tonight, they'll know that elephants are my favorite animal. And if I'm given a choice between watching lions sleeping or elephants going down to drink, the lions get binned every single time. So I'm going to try and compress what amounts to 3 decades of elephant experiences into about 10 or 15 minutes. It's pretty challenging So what I thought I would do is I'd use the tried and tested method of storytelling, have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And in so doing, I've cherry-picked a few vignettes that will hopefully actually show you how gentle and sentient these creatures really are. So anyway, in the beginning, as they say, when I grew up in the sort of rural areas of Zimbabwe and Namibia, and even in South Africa, everybody thought that I was, wildlife was the route that I was going to go. But in actual fact, I was more interested in studying medicine. And it actually took an elephant to knock me off of that path. And it happened as a student. It was my very first visit to that wonderful place that we've spoken about on so many of these campfire evenings, and that's the place called Mana Pools. And it was my very first visit there. A bunch of students, I don't know how many cases of beer, but certainly the pickup was full. And we had one giant old cottage tent. Now, I don't know if you guys remember what those cottage tents were like, but they had 2 poles and a whole bunch of ropes, and you popped this tent up. It had no ground sheet. It was just bare earth, and that was your tent. So anyway, all of us put this tent up. We're all going to sleep in the same tent, like a sort of barracks or a dormitory. And we set the tent up, and we set it up under a tree, which at that time, totally unknown to me, is a tree that the elephants in Mana Pools love the fruit of. And it's known as a winter thorn. And it drops these beautiful protein-rich fruits that are nicknamed elephant cookies. And we put our tent up underneath this tree and had a few beers that night around the campfire. We're in the middle of the bush. None of us knew what the hell we were doing, to be honest with you. And then we all crept into our cottage tent, into our sleeping bags, and we started to go to sleep. Then suddenly there was this noise of stuff raining down on the tent, and one of the guys said, what's that rain? Why? It shouldn't be raining. It's the wrong time of year. So I couldn't understand. I heard a funny noise outside. Couldn't understand what was going on. So lying there, I just lifted the flap of the cottage tent where my head was, stuck my head out of the tent, and I gazed around in the starlight. I couldn't see what was going on. There was this tree trunk right next to me, and I just looked. I couldn't see anything. Then this tree trunk, which was about the distance of where my computer screen is from my head now, this whole tree trunk moved. And that was one of the elephant's legs, and it just moved over to one side. Well, we all jumped out of that tent, and we sat and watched this guy, much like the camp raider who liked lemons. This guy had come for the winter thorn fruit, and he was so used to the campers, nothing frightened him. And he became a bit of a legend, a bit of a naughty legend, that guy. He also got a hankering after citrus, and eventually they banned anybody from bringing oranges into Mana Pools because he would quite literally rip cars apart to get at a pocket of oranges. But we sat that evening doing a dance around the tent as this guy walked around the tent. We were all on the other side. And that was really my first introduction to how wonderful and gentle elephants can be. And that actually completely changed the idea of what I wanted to do as a career. So eventually the studies are finished, and I end up going to Mala Mala, where I met Lloyd. And for a lot of guides in the business, these private reserves alongside the Kruger Park is where you sort of cut your teeth on guiding. And it's also where you first sort of soil your britches viewing elephants. It's where you sort of learn how to watch elephants, how to approach them, how to behave around them, and how to get the best out of these sightings. And one of my very early experiences at Mala Mala was with this little breeding herd of elephants that occasionally came onto Mala Mala. And the whole herd was in the middle of the Sand River, and I took the Land Rover down a steep bank into the Sand River, and I got my tow hitch snagged on the bank with my back wheels stuck up in the air. I couldn't go anywhere. And my front wheels were in the thick sand, so I was stuck, absolutely stuck. And this was just as the light was starting to fade. And anybody who's been on safari will know that during night drives, we try not to spotlight elephants because they really don't like it. And some smart aleck decided that it was a good time to switch on their spotlight whilst watching this herd of elephants. Well, they just hit an absolute flat panic. And this entire herd came barreling towards my car full of clients. I actually can't even remember where they were from. But this herd came barreling towards this one and only exit of the riverbank where I had got myself stuck. And they just completely surrounded the vehicle with all their trumpeting and their squealing, and the babies didn't know what was going on, and the mothers didn't know what was going on. And we were in this cloud of dust, just hanging there. And we had to wait, I don't know, it felt ages. It was probably not more than 5 minutes for these elephants to settle down and realize that we weren't any harm, and they walked out of the river past us. I turned around to see where everybody, how everybody was, and there was not a seat with a bum on it. Every single person in my vehicle was crammed onto the floor of the game drive vehicle, and I had no idea. I had sat in this cloud of dust watching these elephants. And this is how many of us sort of get we learn how to deal with elephants from early on in your careers. And at Mala Mala, there was not only, we had a couple of characters there. And I'm glad Lloyd spoke about Camp Raider. But there was one particular individual that I want to talk about tonight. He was a hell of a character. And he really was the antithesis of the Camp Raider. This guy, I think he probably got a kick out of, and probably a little bit of an elephant chortle, out of striking fear into the hearts of every greenhorn snot ranger. Now, whether he was a mean-spirited bully or just a wicked prankster, when his name was mentioned, guides would go weak at the knees. And many guys would say, I'm not coming to that sighting because my guests are scared of elephants.
Yeah.
That was not true. That was because the ranger was scared of this guy. And his name, his very scary name, was Lightbulb.
Yeah, that's right. I remember that.
So Lightbulb knew who all the newbies were. He knew who all the snot rangers were. And he would pick them off one by one. And quite literally, he would hear a game drive vehicle coming down the road, and he would hide behind a little rock or a bush or something, and then he would come barreling out of behind that and shout and scream and throw dust and send that vehicle racing through the gears to get out of there. And I'm sure he got a big kick out of it. Well, nobody was immune, and everybody had their turn to get nailed by Lightbulb. And at the time, I was working at Kirkman's camp that Lloyd mentioned tonight. And at about 3:30 in the afternoon, you leave for your afternoon game drive. And I decided to go straight across the Sand River to the other side and entail going through the river crossing known as Kirkman's Crossing, which, if you remember, Lloyd, was thick sand, thick. It was low range, first gear. You had to crawl through this crossing to get to the other side, probably slower than walking speed.
Yeah. And
I was halfway through this crossing, sort of grinding through the sand at really slow speed. And I looked up to my left, and there were these two bull elephants having a little bit of a sparring match. And one of them was getting bullied a little bit more than the other, kept sort of taking the brunt of all the sparring that was going on. And then I saw his left ear. And my eyes went wide, because the reason he was called Lightbulb is because he had this perfect light bulb shape cut out of his left ear. Very, very distinguishable. And at this point, the two had stopped sparring, and they were staring at each other. And I think Lightbulb was summing me up. I didn't know at the time that's what he was doing, but that's what I think he was doing. And like that, he turned and just started coming at me at full pace. He left nothing behind. He was at full speed. Dust was flying. It was frightening, and I could go nowhere. I was stuck in the stick sand, and I could go nowhere. And I was bracing for him to hit the vehicle. And I was banging on the side of the vehicle and shouting and so on. It didn't do anything. He just kept coming until he stopped right next to the passenger, this gentleman who was sitting on my left-hand side. He stopped right next to him in this big cloud of dust. Stood there for about 10 seconds, then took a trunk full of sand and threw it over all the occupants of the vehicle like he was throwing confetti at a wedding. Turned on his heels and walked away like he owned the place. So this was we left at 3:30. Now we normally stop at about 6 o'clock for sundowners. Well, we drove out of Kirkman's camp, out of Kirkman's crossing, got onto the other side to a lookout point there, and we broke out the box right then and there, and whiskies all around. It certainly got everybody's attention. After that, he left me alone. I never had another incident with light bulb for the rest of my stay at Banela. I saw him many times, but he'd had his way with me, not in a biblical sense, thank goodness, but he had his way with me, and he left me alone thereafter and picked on all the other new guys. All right. So that's just another one of those little vignettes. And then a few years later on, I've moved to Botswana. Very first year in Botswana, we were working at a camp called Chawero here just outside of Kasane, where I live now. Lovely camp, overlooks the Chobe River, beautiful views, and I am now in elephant paradise. I was just blown away when I arrived here, and it's not small herds of elephants like we had at Banela. This is now herds of 90, 100. You could go out in the afternoon, and you still do, and you can see 1,000 elephants on an afternoon's game drive without breaking a sweat. So it's really quite a special place for elephant viewing. But we had another character, like a camp raider and like a light bulb, who decided that Chawero camp was his place that he was going to pick on everybody there. And we had an access road that took us into the village to go and get our supplies, go and pick up staff, etc., etc. And this elephant, whom with his mischievous nature, we had dubbed him Dennis. Dennis, obviously, because he was the menace. And Dennis, again, would hear a vehicle coming, and he could be 50, 100 meters off the road. He would make his way, beeline to the road, and then set up a roadblock. And you could not get around him. He would walk half a yard off the road. If you started to come forward, he would reach back with his leg and make sure that it was in the middle of the road so you couldn't go past. And he would hold you hostage there for as long as he possibly could. And so we got to know Dennis quite well. Eventually, we had a working relationship, so to speak, and you could get past Dennis once he knew who you were. And then we got a new manager, and this is a wonderful man. Sadly, he's not with us anymore. Banela. He in his own right became a legendary guide and guide trainer in Zambia. But Banela came and joined us for his first guiding career, part of his guiding career at Chawero. And in the first week he was there, he offered to go and pick up the staff in the early morning. And I said to him, yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Alan. You can go pick up the staff. I said, but should you meet an elephant on the road, it'll be Dennis, no doubt. You've got to hold your ground. Do not back off, because if he knows that you're going to back off, you'll never win with this guy. So Alan says, nods his head knowingly, and I hear the vehicle leave just after dawn, and about 10 minutes later, it comes racing back into camp. And I think, no, he can't have picked up the staff. Or I go outside, and there's Alan, and he's all ashen faced. And I said, what's happened? So he said, no, I think I met Dennis. So I said, yeah, and did you just carry on? You must hold your ground. He said, I did hold my ground. So what are you talking about? No, he said, Dennis was there in the road. He wouldn't let me pass. And I didn't move. I would not move. I just stayed exactly where I was. And he kept coming, and he kept coming, and he kept coming. And eventually he was standing right in front of the vehicle. I said, and then what did you do? He said, no, I stood my ground. I wouldn't move. I listened to you. So I said, what are you doing back here? He said, no. Dennis put the tip of his trunk on the bumper of the car, and then went Alan said he just put it in reverse and he just screamed back to camp. So, yeah, that's Dennis. He had Alan's number, and he was also a gentle elephant, but very mischievous. Yeah, he I don't think he's around anymore. We don't see him. He was quite recognizable, but he was, again, knew his size, knew who was the boss, and let everybody know about it. Anyway, after Chawero, my wife Sharon and I, we went out to Cylinder, ran camps there, and eventually ended up doing walking safaris. And I just want to remind, for those of you who've done a few of these campfires with Lloyd, you will remember an old gentleman elephant he spoke about by the name of Nelson. And Nelson, of one tusk and one eye, was probably the gentlest elephant I've ever come across in my life. Huge, enormous guy, old, he's block, he's seen and done everything, and he's just a gentle old soul. And when we were doing the walking safaris, there was one particular camp on the Zabadianja Lagoon, where right next to that camp there was a nice bay where the elephants would come down to drink every single evening. They'd follow the same pathway. For decades, they had followed the same pathway. They had created a highway down to this one bay where they would drink. And they had, like clockwork, they would go and drink at one spot, and then they'd move over to another spot, they'd go and have a mud bath, and then they would leave. And it would be one herd after the other in rotation would do this. So it was a wonderful place to start our afternoon walk, because we'd do a morning walk, get to camp, have lunch, a siesta, and then we'd head out on an afternoon walk, just a short walk from camp. And right on the edge of this bay, there was an area where the mud had dried after elephants had been walking in there. And the elephants had left these enormous craters where their feet had been, and they were just perfect for sitting in. You'd sit on the ground and your feet would sit nicely inside one of these elephant footprints, and it was like sitting in a chair. And we would sit there and we would watch herd after herd coming down to drink, go for a mud bath, and disappear. And there's always one individual that decides they're not going to follow the norm, and this was Nelson. And he started coming down, and I was watching him out the corner of my eye, and he was quite a long way off, and he broke off of that elephant highway, and he started coming straight towards us, and I mean straight towards us. And we're all sitting in these elephant footprints. Couldn't really go anywhere. I had the lagoon on one side, I had thick reeds on the other side, and the only exit was the pathway that Nelson was walking on. So I waited until he was very close, and I just stood up out of my elephant footprint, and I stood there and waved my arms above my head and made a few clucking noises, and he opened his eyes, because elephants walk with their eyes closed. It's quite funny. They use their trunk and their sense of smell and their hearing to basically, that's how they see their world. Their sense of smell is their best, most powerful sense, so they use that mostly. And then eyesight is just a means to, confirm what they're smelling. Anyway, he suddenly stopped, and it looked like someone had given him an electric shock, and he suddenly stopped and jerked, and all the dust flew off of his skin. And he looked down at me, because I was that close. He looked right down at me, and I just started talking to him, and I said, Nelson, we've got to get out of here. And he just stood there, looked at me, and he literally stepped off of the pathway and let us walk past him less than 5 yards from him. And once we had walked past him, he didn't even turn around, didn't raise his head. He just carried on down to the river and did his thing. And that's just another example of how incredibly gentle these huge 6-ton animals can be. And so I think, to end, I'm going to take us back full circle. And it's funny how that happens in these incidences, is history comes around full circle. And it was just a couple of years ago, when I was camping in Wangi with a good friend of mine who's on here tonight, Mike and Sue. And we were camping at their invitation at a place called Ngweshla, which is a wonderful little private campsite in one of the most stunning areas of Wangi National Park in Zimbabwe. And this public picnic site becomes your own private campsite after dark. And it's quite funny to see this place because it's got these enormous iron gates to keep King Kong out, basically. So you come through, you drive into this picnic site, and there's these enormous iron gates that the camp hand religiously clangs shut every night at sunset, and he goes out first thing in the morning before dawn and opens those big iron gates for you. If you look at the rest of the campsite there, the fence is gone. The fence posts are gone. There is absolutely nothing stopping anything coming into that camp. Those big gates, I don't know what their purpose is, but anyway, they clang you in at night. Anyway, we arrived at Ngweshla, and this is another place where there's a particular tree that also puts out a pod that the elephants love. And that's called a Camelthorn Acacia. Place has got thousands upon thousands of Camelthorn Acacias there. And there's one Camelthorn Acacia inside the picnic site. And I decided, much to my wife's chagrin, that I was going to put the tent underneath the Camelthorn tree. And when we arrived, there was an elephant in the campsite, wandering around, looking at everybody, eating Camelthorn pods, and so on. And I waited till he moved off, and we put our tent in there. And he disappeared that night, or that evening. We had our dinner, and we sat around telling campfire stories around a real campfire. And then we all went to bed. And it was not within probably 15 minutes. There was that raining sound again in the middle of the dry season. And Sharon said, I think that elephant is back. And sure enough, there he was. He was shaking this Camelthorn tree, and it was raining pods all over our tent. And he was busy eating the pods, munching away. You could hear him salivating over these things and crunching these pods, and he was having a gay old time. And I said, well, there's nothing we can do. We just, we'll just go to sleep. And suddenly it all went quiet, absolutely dead still. And then about probably less than a foot away from our heads, we could hear this deep inhalation and deep exhalation. And this old bull had fallen asleep with his trunk probably less than a foot away from our heads. And so we had gone to bed, and this old boy had done exactly the same. And it was probably one of the greatest privileges I've ever had, is to actually have an elephant in my bedroom almost. And sleeping with, we both fell asleep whilst this guy was breathing in our ear, which was really quite nice. And that is my very brief 30-year experience with elephants. And I hope you all enjoyed them. And just because you can't clap, I thought I'd...
Thank you. Thanks, Grant. Folks, thank you very much, mate. So if you have a look on the screen here, folks, you'll find there's a person, well, her name is actually Sylvia, but it says Independent Examination Board on her name. She will tell you, she was on safari with me. She's my aunt, my father's sister. She was on safari with me in northern Botswana once when an elephant lay down outside her tent and went to sleep on a sloping termite mound and kept her awake the entire night through its snoring. So that's what I say, when elephants are like people. I want to also just pinpoint, if you look for a person called Shane on there, he's also worked at Mala Mala with us, and you pin his video, you will see that there's an elephant picture behind him, and I've no doubt that he took that picture himself. There you go. Can you guys see that? That's your picture. Shane, that looks like a minor pools picture, mate. I think you're muted.
Mute yourself, Shane.
You're muted. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I got you. Is that a minor pools picture?
It's actually two bull elephants sparring off in Etosha National Park.
Etosha.
And the background scene is from the Halb River Valley.
Ah, sneaky. Move aside. I can't see it properly.
And it's a painting done by a Cape Town artist who took 2 of my photographs and did a...
I see. All right. Okay, lovely. Who's the artist?
Sue Mars.
Oh, okay. Fantastic and appropriate for this evening. One of the things I think that Grant has highlighted, and which I was doing also with the Camp Raider, is that elephants and their intelligence are absolutely individual, every single one of them, and that they do have a sense of humor. And any of us who worked at Mala Mala and knew the light bulb and the Camp Raider will know that they reacted differently and individually to each person. One of the things about, and I want to ask Peter Allison a question now, but I just want to preface it this way and say that elephants have their off days. They have good days and bad days. Some of them are mean-spirited and some of them are generous. And but one of the most wonderful experiences you can have is to be in the presence, as Grant described, with a giant bull elephant who is so peaceful and so tolerant of your presence because there's this trust in you that you're going to bring it to no harm. And we do that at minor pools where we sometimes, well, it depends on the guest. Not all the guests are up for this thing because they're afraid of elephants until they learn better. But we will have a huge old bull. He might be 60 years old. He might be 6,000 kilograms. And we gather all those seed pods and we put them in a pile, and the elephant comes and he feeds from them. He would have eaten them anyway. It's just we save him a bit of time, and we set up the cameras, and we settle ourselves in the shade. And those elephants come within meters of us, and they are absolutely placid and giant. And they do a special thing there that I've seldom seen elsewhere, and they're famous for it. They rock back like a circus elephant, which is why you can train circus elephants to do this, because elephants can do this in the first place. They rock back on their legs, balance on their hind legs, their front legs are in the air, and they reach up as high as they can with their trunks, and they take down the pods and sometimes small leaves and twigs from those giant Fedherbia albida, the not the camelthorn, the winterthorn trees. And you might have seen that picture, and if you have, it's probably from Mana Pools. But Pete, I want to ask you a question, if I might. You there, Pete?
I'm here.
Hello, mate.
I'll turn my video with my favorite photo of an elephant behind me.
Oh, have you started it? I'm just having a look. Hang on.
I don't know. I was never a very good guide, but I've always liked this photo of an elephant.
Oh, there you are. Oh, that elephant. Yes. Yeah, a tuskless one, I see.
Yeah. It's more and more common.
Okay, and the short-trunked tuskless elephant. And actually, yes. Peter's going to be with us next month, so this is a sort of let's say a soft introduction to Peter Allison. But I want to ask you, we're talking about big bulls and how gentle and relaxed they are, but there's always been this idea, perhaps it's an idea, a notion, that tuskless female elephants are vicious, violent, bad-tempered, and just plain nasty. What do you think about that? Ones without.
Well, I've heard the same thing about the French, and I don't believe that that's true at all. Toothless sometimes, but no, they do have the full range of humans, and I think what's really important that you and Grant have both brought up is they have off days. I got to know really well, and it's one of the great privileges of staying a while in one place is getting to know individual animals, elephants or otherwise. You get to know their territory, you get to know their personalities.
Oh, Peter Allison.
As we can. And there are just days where you go, I've got no idea why they're doing this. This is so character. It's quite wonderful. And one of my, actually a question I wanted to ask Grant was, what's his favorite myth about elephants to dispel? And I hope we can come back to that. But one of my favorite things is when you're on game drive or now, and I'm typically up in the back now, somebody will say to a guide, how old is this elephant? And they'll say 37. Mm. And So he goes, how does he know that? And I go, I'm not sure. Maybe he was there when it was born, but if I look through this little grid of people here, I have no idea how old any of you are, and we're the same species. So we can make an estimate, and there's just grain of salt in some of this stuff. But Grant, I'd seriously love to hear if there's something you hear repeatedly about elephants, or that's from ancient myth that you are constantly dispelling or irks you because you hear it again and again.
Well, it's that one that people ask, are they dangerous? And the other thing that really irks me is when someone calls an elephant a rogue elephant. I don't believe there's ever such a thing as a rogue elephant. There are elephants that have been chased and they've got bullet wounds in them, and they're not a rogue elephant. They're an elephant that's gone through absolute hell, and he just feels like he needs to defend himself or herself. That whole ancient thing about rogue elephant it really irks me when people say, was it a rogue elephant? The elephant graveyard is also
that's the one I was going to mention. The so-called graveyard.
That was a myth that the great white hunters of yore, they all hoped that they would find this mythical elephant's graveyard where it would be so much easier just to go and pick up all these thousands of tusks when tusks were quite literally white gold. They were the plastic of its time, and it was used in just about every single everyday object you could think of. And so, during that time, the elephants were, all the hunters would talk about finding this elephant's graveyard. But it's just a myth.
The ivory Eldorado.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Pete, there's a question here from Jennifer Fries, and she's asked, is there a certain characteristic of the elephant that's useful for distinguishing one individual elephant from another, aside from size? And also, is there a specific mating season for elephants? Can you answer those?
You're asking me that?
I am.
Well, I'm a high school dropout. Don't do that to me. There's probably half the audience here more qualified than me. But to start at the end, there is no distinct mating season. They have their pregnancy famously long, in fact, the longest of any existing animal, of 22 months roundabout. So seasonality is just really hard to manage. So they'll mate and be born at any time. I imagine places like Namibia, and I'm just taking a guess here, there might be peaks at certain times. Estrus might be synchronized more to favor young then, but I don't know that for sure. As the first bit is to characteristics, quite often it's the tusk size and shape that gives it away. And elephants have a tuskedness, just as we have a handedness. So they're left or right tusked, and there's more wear on one, and that can lead to shapes or to one tusk being broken, and which can give quite a characteristic mark. Some are ambituskdrous, which is not a word, but should be. So there's those characteristics. The other thing, and I think somebody mentioned here with an elephant called Lightbulb, that he had a light bulb shaped hole in his ear. The holes in their ears, and particularly some of these old bulls, they're like your grandma's curtains. They're moth-eaten and tattered, and this filigree of an elephant's ear really tells you who it is.
Yeah.
Somebody's upset with me. I upset somebody all the time. Sorry if you've just looked at your curtains and thought I was talking about you. But so there's certain characteristics like that. I knew an elephant who had tusks that curved, instead of in any way forward, just came straight out sideways and then curved around like Dali's moustache. And she was known as Salvador. And she had a daughter with the same tusks, just less developed, and then eventually a granddaughter who just had these tiny little fins coming out sideways. Clearly hereditary and adorable. And the only time I ever saw it as an impediment, and she was she had the temperament of a relaxed old bull. And one day I was just watching her, and I was in a vehicle, and unusually she was in the middle of the herd, despite being the matriarch. And the rest of them walked through 2 palm trees, and as she walked up, she got there, paused for a moment, and walked around. I thought she was punk.
I think, folks, the important thing to know about wild animals is we tend to look at them as one thing. Every zebra is the same, you know, but absolutely not. They're as different as the dogs in your own household or the cats. They have different shapes, different habits, different moods. And elephants are no different to that. They're literally different sizes as people are. Some are taller, some are shorter, some have longer or shorter trunks, different shaped heads. The ears are very easy to tell apart because they get ripped like curtains, as Pete points out. So after a while, if you spend time with these animals, you will, and you know, that's why we know the different lions and we give them names. And that's also why if you're watching a wildlife documentary as a guide or someone in the know, you know that they're faking this thing. They've been a bit naughty, but what they've done is they've created a 50-minute video for you. And where let's say they're doing it on cheetahs, and they followed a cheetah and her cubs for a while, and it's fantastic. You know, mothers and babies and defending them and hunting for them. It's all good story, and it's all about story. And then suddenly you see that cheetah mother make a kill. This is a real example. The cheetah makes a kill, and you look and you go, but hang on, it's a different cheetah. Now we can see that because they've got different spots, different facial patterns. Leopards are very distinct, especially in their facial spots. You know, and we get used to looking for that, and of course we get a bit silly and look for those kind of mistakes. But
sometimes it's different prey.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's chasing an impala and then it's feeding a warthog to the babies. So there's all sorts of tricks that they get up to. But the point is that each animal is different, and elephants are even easier to tell apart than, let's say, impalas, for example. Folks, I want to move on to a second, or rather, in this case, a third elephant story. And it has a different mood to it. And I alluded earlier to the fact that we like to have animals in camp. We choose not to fence the camps. We want them there. We welcome there. They were there before us. But when you build a camp, people need to be safe. And so what we typically do then is we elevate the walkway so people can be above the lions and above the hippos at nighttime when they walk home slightly tipsy from the Boma fire, you know, above animals moving through, except possibly elephants. And it all adds to the magic and allure and mystery of being in a camp and having the animals right there. It's very, very important. Sometimes things go wrong. And there's lots of these stories, doom and gloom stories. And I think as guides, we probably tend not to tell these stories as much because they're always accidental. They sometimes quite sad for the animal. And you'll see where I'm going with this. And they're not the norm. That's the point. But it is important to know that as guides, or as people rather, in camps and wildlife areas, we have a responsibility to behave ourselves too. We expect the animals to behave, but we need to take care of how we behave there as well. And one of the things about habituated animals, wild animals, as opposed to tame animals, which are ones that you feed, therefore they depend upon you like house pets. Wild animals don't take food from us, but they do tolerate us provided we behave ourselves. And provided we do the same thing time and time again so that there's consistency, so they know what to expect. And we appreciate consistency from them. And Pete pointed out that we're moody, they're moody, so you just never know. But this story is about, it's an example of where things can go wrong. And it's an elephant story with, unfortunately, a rather sad ending, but it illustrates a point. And it takes us to southern Tanzania and the Ruaha National Park. Some of you may have been there on the Rufiji River. And there's a camp that I went to there. We were flying in, I was flying in with some guests, and I was in the airplane, and the pilot handed me his phone. He'd got a signal on his cell phone, mobile phone, from HQ, and he showed it to me, and I could read the message, the text message, and it said that he needed to pick up a body bag at the airstrip, a body bag which had been filled and zip closed. Now, we spoke about elephant-human encounters, and sometimes those are fatal. Mostly they're fatal for the elephants, but on occasion it can be people. If it is a fatality where a person has died, it is almost always a tribal villager who's gone to his crops, or he's walking to school, or he's gone looking for the goats, or is out and about, perhaps tending the water, and an elephant arrives and things can escalate. But just occasionally, unfortunately, it's the animal that gets hurt. And the guy said there's a body bag there. So I said, just radio the camp and tell them, you never know with these guys. It can be a little bit rough and ready out there. Make sure the body bag's not lying on the ground when we get off the plane. It doesn't set the right tone. You know, that's part of what we do, is you've got to try and think ahead. And it's just as well, because that's exactly what had happened. And so they moved it into a shed nearby. I didn't tell the guests that there was a body. I had no idea what had happened. I just knew that it was a body. But when I landed, I spoke to the guide, and he was in a bit of a flutter. And I'd assumed that it was a staff member, and he said to me, it's actually one of the guests in the camp that you are going to this morning. Now, that little airstrip serves 4 or 5 camps in the area, but it turned out to be the very camp we were going to. I didn't tell the guests. We got into the Land Rovers and we went to camp, after which they then loaded the body onto the bag, the body bag into the plane. We drove to camp. We saw lots of elephants. Elephants were relaxed all the way along the Rufiji River, through the dongas and ravines, and the riverine forest. It was an absolutely beautiful little drive, actually. And we got to camp, and the manager there was clearly very upset. Now, I still didn't know what had gone on. The guide wouldn't tell me. And he couldn't tell me anyway, because the guests were there. And I needed to know first what was happening before I knew how to deal with this. And as you well know, when you go on these safaris, you get a full introduction, and then you go off to your tents, and then you typically come back and you have lunch. And part of the introduction always, and it's a legal requirement, as you can imagine, is the safety talk. And it covers things like the water, Andrea, and Hillary, I know you're there, drinking safe water, and how to behave in camp. You know, what is safe, and also in the darkness, you need to be escorted, typically by an armed ranger or guide, or in Kenya, maybe by a Maasai askari with a spear. There's different ways of doing it. So the guests were then given this safety briefing, and part of the briefing was, there are elephants wandering through camp. Please be careful. This was a Dutch lady who was living in southern Tanzania and had been there for years and absolutely loved wildlife. I then pulled her aside and I said, I need to know what's going on. The poor lady was distraught. She was she then kind of became very emotional, and she let it go. And the story, and she walked me across. She said, look, let me show you something. And we walked, I'd say, from the dining area across the fire pit, perhaps 20 meters to the river bank. And below us was the water. And there were elephants there while we were talking, lots of elephants, peacefully going about their business. And she said, look at this. And we looked down, and there was a pool of blood in the sand. They'd tried to cover it, but you know how it congeals. So it had gone all maroon and dried out. And she said, that woman 4 hours ago was killed standing here by an elephant in this camp this morning after breakfast. And she's a guest. This is the first time I realized that it was actually a guest who'd been killed. Now, the further tragedy of it was that she was on honeymoon with her husband. They were Italians, and neither of them spoke English. So it made it all the more difficult. And the husband was still in camp. So there was a lot of stuff to deal with at this time. And what you don't want to do, of course, is create panic. And you've got to try to add some perspective to this scene. She gave me the story, and it went thus. This Italian guy had, of course, been given the briefing the day before. They'd been on a game drive. They'd come back that evening. They'd had a long flight into Kilimanjaro International Airport. They'd gone straight to bed. And in the morning, they'd elected not to go on the game drive, but have a late breakfast. And so in their own time, they'd come through in the light of day. And while they were having breakfast, an elephant and her calf, a young calf, had wandered up the riverbank and was feeding right there 20 meters from where they were having breakfast. He had the very latest and largest bazooka-style lens, and he felt the need to go and take very close-up pictures of this, despite the fact he had a lens. He could have sat there sipping his cappuccino and taken equally good pictures. Unfortunately, the manager had gone out to the kitchen to organize the fried tomatoes or whatever it was. And in that moment, this Italian, and it only took a minute, had walked down towards that elephant, despite all warnings, and clearly he hadn't really understood them. And despite common sense, that's the thing, right? You'd think you don't need to be told this stuff. But some people do, because they assume that because you can park very close to a wild animal on a game drive, that it's a tame animal, that it's harmless, that it's like a zoo. And somehow this disconnect happens between what's on the ground next to the car and the bubble that you're in within the car. It's as if you're watching a movie, a wildlife video. You know, the only thing that's missing is David Attenborough's commentary. And people somehow can't make that transition sometimes. And so, therefore, in his mind, when he walked towards that elephant, it was perfectly safe. The elephant did what wild animals do when you approach them too closely and you change the rules. It gave him due warning. It trumpeted and screamed. It was the wife who was subsequently killed. It trumpeted and screamed and warned her, but she ignored it. She stood there. It was as if she was watching a movie. And after 2 or 3 false charges, again, you know that's what elephants do, and it was protecting its baby, it stabbed her to death, right there, in camp. Now, that's an awful tragedy. And for those of you who've been on safari, you'll know that you very often in close encounters, and you wonder about the safety of it. But the problem that happened there was not so much that they didn't understand the warning, but that they just didn't use their common sense. And so, as a result of that, there was a body bag at the airstrip and a tragic death on safari. 2 things about that. One, strangely, and rather horrifically, it's good for business. Those stories get into the media, and it somehow adds to the edginess and allure of going on safari. Quite often, you'll see a spike in bookings as a result of some story, some tragic story that's taken place, because it's just like young men going to war. It's never going to happen to you, okay? The other thing that happens is that the elephant was gunned down. They called in the Rangers. The Rangers were armed with AK-47s. It's a submachine gun, an automatic machine gun. It's not designed for killing elephants. It's a weapon of war for killing people. It's not very accurate. It shoots the wrong size slug and too slowly. If you want to shoot an animal, there are specific calibers that you want to use, guns that can kill them with a single shot, and you do it humanely. But those guys are armed with AK-47s. They chased that animal out of camp, not very far, perhaps half a kilometer, and then they gunned it down under machine gun fire, both the female elephant and the baby. And that had happened only an hour or 2 before we got there. Having gathered all this knowledge, at lunchtime, I then told the guests about it, and in a very calm way. And you can imagine that they were fascinated by the story, slightly scared, but what was underlined was the fact that what you've done is you've bought a safari, you're in the wilds, you've put yourself in the presence of wild animals, which is what you wanted to do. Now you need to respect them. And it can be somewhat difficult with just a few guests on safari because they don't respect the fact that that animal is potentially, I don't like talking about dangerous game. I talk about potentially dangerous game. And they're typically only dangerous because we make them so. Because after they've warned us, we keep ignoring it, and then they do what they have to do, which is to defend themselves. That story is called Body Bag, and it's a story in Confessions of a Safari Guide. And the point of putting that story in that book was to say, listen, bad stuff does happen out there, but usually it's our own fault. So that's my final elephant story. Grant, can I come back to you? Would you like to comment further?
Yo, man, that's a pretty intense story. And these things do happen, but you sort of reminded me of an incident that you had at Cylinder. I don't know if you remember that very nice Japanese bachelor that came out to Cylinder.
I remember the story. Tell it.
On the day that he arrived, Nelson came into Cylinder Camp. And Nelson was just being Nelson, and he was wandering around the camp. And I mean, you could quite literally stand in this elephant shadow, and he didn't mind. As long as you were on his sighted side, you didn't go on his blind side. And this Japanese guy had stood there at the dining room and had his photograph taken with a bull elephant in the middle of Africa. And then the next day, I think you were taking him on you were transferring him to another camp, or you were doing something. You came and picked him up from Cylinder. And then you went out on one of the back roads, and blow me down, you came across a Cylinder pride.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I got the whole thing right, but if I recall correctly, he jabbered something to you, handed you his camera, and then started to step out of the vehicle to go and stand amongst the lions to have his photograph taken.
Yeah, yeah.
And you had to quite literally yank him back into the car.
Well, it was in thick bush, and I said to him, let's get closer. And he thought I meant, let's all get out the car and get closer. And he started getting out. And I managed to grab him by the waistband and haul him back in. We were meters from the lion. I don't know whose fault that was. His English wasn't great.
Probably mine. Don't let a Japanese guy take a photograph next to an elephant in the middle of bush when he doesn't understand what's going on. It sets a bad precedent.
I want to just go back to Peter for any comments, and then lastly, if I can come back to you, Grant, there is a question from Tom Doody, and it's a very relevant question right now about the elephant die-off in northern Botswana, and just an update from that. But before we do that, Pete, is there anything you'd like to add?
No, just if anybody's keen to join next month, there will of course be some more stories, but also something, again, all of these stories are the things that grow your passion, the great guides and the people like me. We stick in this industry because we love it, we truly love it. You wouldn't do it for any other reason. But what I've got a talk that I first did in Singapore, and it was titled then Conservation for People Who Hate Animals. And it was to the Singapore Nature Society. And of course, there was nobody there that hated animals. But what I was trying to do is to help them explain why it's important to conserve animals, even if you don't care about them. And I'm presuming anybody here that's sat through an hour and 20 minutes of elephant stories loves animals. But how do you convince someone that doesn't, that prefers ballet to elephants, that elephants are more important? And the reason I've picked ballet is I did an empirical study on charity giving in the United States and United Kingdom, where really accurate records are kept through tax records. And if you take every dollar that is given to charity in the US or UK, less than 1 cent goes to wildlife. The bulk goes to health and to children, which I'm not going to particularly argue against, but the arts and the various arts generate far more revenue donations than wildlife. And so one of the things I want to talk about next month is how dragonflies may save us from the next great pandemic, or prior to COVID, what every health expert was saying was the greatest threat to human health. And dragonflies have the answer to that. Something recognized back in the 1960s was that despite elephants and other enormous animals' massive size, and the abundance of cells they've got, this huge number of cells they have, they don't die from cancer. And it's only recently that we've started to figure out why that is. And it boils down to this. In 1918, World War I, more people were dying from infections than from bullets. So let's say modern medicine is barely 100 years old. Life has been experimenting and running its own laboratories for 3.2 billion years. We talk about some of the amazing research and results they've turned up. And only now, I think, are we turning around and looking at, before we start going to a lab, we're looking to wildlife. And of course, coming back to dragonflies, without wetlands, you don't have dragonflies. You need extraordinary habitats to home elephants and all the other things that are going to be sustained within that. So it's talking about that. And then, of course, stories about me making really bad errors of judgment, because I was, I grew up in Sydney, unlike Lloyd and Grant. I'd never faced anything more vicious than a parrot when I was a kid. And I had 2 Labradors, so the parrots were infinitely more aggressive. And then I somehow at 19, I just stumbled my way into becoming a safari guide at 19, and I literally didn't even, I was given a rifle and a Land Rover, and I'd never touched a firearm in my life, and I'd also never driven a car. So, and took my first game drive that afternoon. So as you can imagine, there's plenty of stories, but then that's now led to this other fascination as to these animals that I've been bewitched by my entire life and always loved, and how they may well turn around and save us all if we'll only save them first.
Fantastic, Peter. Peter works for Natural Habitat, no, Natural Selection.
Yes, off, Lloyd.
Beg your pardon, mate. He works for Natural Selection Safaris, based out of South Africa, although currently he's sitting in Shrewsbury in England. And it's been my privilege to work with Pete for many years, as with Grant, who is Last Chance Safaris in Botswana. Thank you. And if you want more of those stories from Peter and those notions and ideas, then Thursday, the 3rd of September is the next time we gather together. Please tune in. We're going to finish with one last question, which is from Tom Doody. And we were going to deal with this anyway, Tom, which is updates, Grant, if you don't mind, on we all know about 300 plus elephants in Botswana dying suddenly. What caused it? What's the update?
Oh, okay. All right. So it's been a little bit of a hot potato. The media, as the media is wont, has run away with it. There's been so much speculation that it's led people to believe all sorts of things. So I won't be speculating. I'll be giving you the update as I know it. I do have a sort of in to some of the institutes that are doing the testing, and I've had a chance to speak to some of the vets and so on. So what we do know is that the area that these elephants died is a very, very localized area. Now, we've spoken about how big our population of elephants are in Botswana. We are sitting at around about anything between 180 and 200,000 elephants, something like that. There's very conflicting reports on how many elephants we've got, but it's somewhere around that. So right now we have 287 recorded deaths, these sudden deaths. The press has said numbers of over 450, 300 plus. We now know that some of those are double counts. The Wildlife Department, along with helicopters, and they've thrown an enormous amount of money at this. They have actually recorded and GPSed every single carcass, and I think it's registered as 287 carcasses. It is unusual that some of these animals have died in an acute manner. Quite literally, they've fallen down in their own footsteps on their sternums, which is a very unusual way for an elephant to die. There is no what we call pedal marks, so there's no lying on the ground and pedaling with the feet and leaving any pedal marks. It is a bit of a mystery. They have done multiple postmortems. They have darted sick animals, ones that were showing these neurological signs of distress. They've darted them, they've taken samples, they have, and I promise you, to do a post-mortem on an elephant is one hell of a job. And these are in sometimes pretty remote places, so they're accessing it by helicopter, they can't get in there by vehicle. It was at the time when the floodwaters were coming on the Okavango, so these places were flooded. It was a nightmare. I'm very proud of what the Botswana government has done to date. They don't talk to the media. They have a bad sort of track record with media, where media have taken things and taken them out of context. So generally, Botswana government just clams up, which I think puts them in a bad light. They should be more forthright with the information that they do have. So this is where we stand at the moment. The samples have been, tissue, blood, all sorts of things have been sent to laboratories around the world, notably a very good pathology lab in Zimbabwe that was looking at any sort of bacterial disease. Everything came back negative. Viruses, so far, nothing has been picked up, and they have done umpteen PCR tests to see if they can pick up anything. And the toxicology reports to date have not revealed anything. I believe there is one toxicology report that is outstanding from the United States. It is the most thorough toxicology analysis, I think, on the planet. And obviously with COVID and courier services and permits, remember the elephant is a CITES 1 animal, so any body part of a CITES 1 animal has to go with a folder of permits for every movement of a piece of that animal. So getting all of these CITES permits together and currying all of these things during the pandemic has been a bit of a mission for the Botswana government. They've had just about every single result back, except I believe the one from the US, and they're waiting for that last one before they'll make a public statement. Now, people who ask me, what do I think? I really don't know. I have seen an incident some years back, it's probably about 11 years ago, where we had a massive die-off of elephants in the Savuti area. And I was actually part of a team that went out there to go and look at these carcasses and take samples and so on. And it was quite clearly, to us, it was quite clearly poisoning. We'd had an incident of about 90, it was nearly 100 pelicans that died in the Savuti marsh. And we don't know what they died of, but they showed neurological symptoms of toxicity. And were acting like birds that have, birds lose fear and they become disorientated when they're poisoned. And you can drive right up to them. And in fact, the leopards were just picking them off, these pelicans in the middle of the Savuti marsh. It was very unusual behavior. Anyway, a whole bunch of them died. And then soon after that, we had these elephants dying. And it was quite clear that it was a toxin because insects and blowflies and maggots and everything around the carcasses also died. So that was quite clear on the ground that it was some form of poison. None of that was evident with these elephants. They all died close to water, or reasonably close to water. That might just be a statistical thing because it was at the end of the rainy season. We had a good rainy season and there was water everywhere. So I don't know how they can say it's related to the water definitively. So to cut a short story long, I don't have an answer for you.
But you're an expert. The guys in Washington say you're an expert.
They do. So I've given an answer like an expert. I should be working for government.
Okay.
But the thing is, there are a number of individuals, and I'm not a fan of this Mr. McCann, Niall McCann. He's jumped on a media bandwagon, and he's been speculating left, right, and centre, all the way to possibly being the next COVID. That popped up in media as well, you know, from animals. So I'm very much against that sort of thing. Let's wait for the answers to come out. I think the Botswana government has now realized that they need to keep people in the loop. And they've been releasing press releases fairly frequently. Their last press release was that they are waiting for this final test result. And then they'll be able to do, put it all together with the postmortems and everything else that they did out in the field. One of the interesting observations was that the animals that they darted that were showing these weird neurological disorders, after they gave them the antidote for the tranquilizer, which is a type of Narcan, it's called N50, but it's a much stronger version of Narcan, which I think everybody's heard of before. And these elephants popped out of their tranquilization, and they got two of them were followed for 48 hours, and they showed no symptoms of neurological disorder thereafter. So somehow that N50 neutralized what was going on with it, and it seemed to sort them out. We have had more carcasses. There have been no more deaths reported. They are still doing surveys and checking to see if for any more fatalities or mortalities, and there have been no more reported. So the episode seems to have come to an end. Sadly, we did lose just shy of 300 elephants, but you do have a population, a growing population of going on 200,000. So it's
okay. Thank you very much, mate. Much appreciated. Just to answer Jennifer's question, have I ever left anybody in camp because I didn't want to take them on game drive because I considered them too dangerous? Once, yes, I have. Destructive teenagers who had been dragged on safari, and they'd much rather been at home for their summer holidays with their friends on the beach, and they were hating it and hating everyone and hating their parents and hating me. Wrong people on board. So we left them with their iPads in camp, and it worked out much better. Okay, 3rd of September, it's a Thursday. It's exactly the same Zoom address. Peter Allison will be there. I'll be hosting, and thanks as always to Carmen Rendell of Soul Hub. Have a look for Soul Hub, folks. It's an incredibly interesting website. She's the one who hosted this. It was her idea in the first place. Carmen, much appreciated. You've been here since March, and we really appreciate you controlling this and creating it as well. So thank you very much to Carmen and Soul Hub.
No problem. Thank you, Lloyd.
And thank you very much, folks. It's good to see you all. I hope to see you again on the 3rd. And yeah, it's time to go and make some dinner or lunch or something, I think. So, hasta la vista. Cheers.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cheers, guys. Thanks for that.
Happy evening.
Thanks for joining in, everybody.
Thanks, Grant. Much appreciated.
Cheers now.
Thank you. Be safe.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Cheers.